Hey everybody, so we are live. So my name is Mark Allard-Will. I'm going to be your host today. I'm a writer mostly for comic books here in Saskatchewan, and I'm joined today by a very special guest. But just to give people some time to join and just to explain how it's going to work, I'll just give you a quick background into how this live show is going to work. I'm going to go through a series of questions with our guest here, and as we get towards the end, I will announce verbally when it is time to start typing in your viewer questions, and I will read those out to our guest who will respond. So without further ado, hello everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, respective of where you're watching from in the world. We are joined today by a newcomer to the Saskatchewan literary scene, Elizabeth Menzie. And so Elizabeth, just to get us started here, can I get you to give us an introduction as to who you are as an individual and as an author, please?
All right. Well, I am a female identified individual. I live in Wynyard, Saskatchewan, but I'm originally from Rosetown, Saskatchewan. I am a wife. I'm a farmer's daughter. I am a survivor of mental health, and I am a animal lover. I really have always enjoyed writing. I've been writing since I was about 12 years old, and I'm a very proud 37-year-old now. And before that, I was telling stories before I could even write or read. So I've always been a bit of a storyteller. And I have written several novellas throughout my lifetime, and short stories and obscenely bad poetry. And then when I kind of settled down here in Wynyard, Saskatchewan, my wife and I live here. And when I started to kind of come into my own and settle down and have my own, life here, I started to realize that I missed writing a bit. So I started doing some of that. And then in the last year, I actually wrote my first completed novel, which is called Northern Lights is the name of the series. And the book title that just came out in the beginning of April is The Druid of Black Lake. And it's the first of a 4-part series. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been a really good experience.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So the series is fantasy, it's young adult. What is it about fantasy in particular that drew you to that genre?
Well, I thought about it, and I guess one of the other things that's really important is that I'm a feminist, and I've always been a feminist even before I knew what that was. And my father is a feminist. So when I was growing up, I had a very strong attraction to female characters and strong female characters in particular. And one of the best things about the fantasy genre is that you can actually challenge gender and sexual identity roles in fantasy that you can't do when your characters happen to be humans, which is something that I find very interesting because people seem to be a lot more accepting of characters being queer identified or gender non-specific or agender or having different ideas about sexuality or just in terms of the way they view each other. It's a lot more accepting if your characters are not human. So my characters in this particular series happen to be werewolves in Canada. And I found it very interesting because my main character in the book is a very strong female character, but she doesn't start off strong. She evolves into a strong character.
That's wonderful. And another question that came to me while you was answering that previous question there is Canada as a setting. So Canada in movies, in books, in literature, authors screenwriters will try to avoid it like the plague because it's a way not to get a project made, right? So the infamous thing with Hollywood is if a movie has to be set in Canada, even if it's a biopic and it to be historically accurate has to be set in Canada, they will change the location to get it funded. How have you found the reaction to having something set in Canada?
Well, I elected to self-publish in the first place. I didn't actually approach a publisher in the first place, not because I didn't think I could get it published, but because I wanted to have more control over it. I wanted my story to remain mine, and I wanted my story to remain authentic. I'm from Canada. I'm from rural Saskatchewan, and I love where I'm from. And I'm comfortable with it, and I'm comfortable with the places that I've lived and the houses that built me, I guess you could say. So I've had lots of good reaction from people who've read it because they know exactly where I'm talking about, and they know that when I'm referring to a place in the book, even though it is a fantasy book, the geography of the book is extremely accurate, because I did an immense amount of research to make sure that when I was describing the places that I was describing, the streets were accurate, the geography of rivers and roads and on maps was accurate. So people seem to enjoy that because they could associate it with where they had been in their own lives as Canadian readers.
That's wonderful. I felt the same way as a reader when I was reading Wes Funk's final book, or what was that called? Frostbite, I believe it's called.
Yeah.
When I was reading that book, I just had this wonderful feeling of when he describes these winter streets in Saskatoon, and he doesn't necessarily describe the streets, but the buildings he's passing and the main character is passing. And it's this wonderful feeling of, it takes you to that moment of like a -50 day that you remember in Saskatoon. It's wonderful. So I can certainly see where you're coming from with that. So you are a newcomer to writing, or to publishing at least, as we covered in my introduction there. What advice would you have as a recently published author for people who are looking to begin their journey through publishing themselves?
I think the most important thing to remember is to be a good editor, for starters. There are mistakes in my first book that I know won't be in my second, primarily because my own editing skills and my own careful skill and my own creativity are better since the first book. So that's really important. But the other thing for self-publishing especially is that it's completely okay to remember that you're going to be your own worst critic. And I really think that stops a lot of people from taking the plunge and trying to get their work out there, is the unknown of, is it good enough? And we are our own very worst critics. We always think that our own work isn't good enough, that someone else is going to be so much better at telling our own story than ourselves. And I think that that's something that's very, very hard to get over. But once you do get over it, it's a really good feeling to get your stuff out there for someone else to read.
Absolutely, yeah, that's wonderful advice. And how does your identity, so I don't know how to phrase this question. There are so many things about myself that, and my personality, my kind of sardonic sense of humor, the way that I critique myself, that ebbs into my writing. How does your identity ebb into your writing?
Well, it's kind of funny because when I started out writing it, this book. And when I started out, like, putting it all together, I didn't base the characters off of people that I knew consciously, because I didn't do that. But one of the things that did happen throughout the book that I hadn't intended was the theme of the strong female lead character that evolved in Charlotte, who's my main character in the book. And that is, she's not necessarily me, because I don't think that that is an accurate representation of who I am. Charlotte's character is her own character. But the way that she evolved from a shy and reserved young woman into a confident and self-assured and dedicated young woman is a really nice evolution throughout the story. And I think that my admiration for female characters that I have read and that I have personally met as human beings really led into that. And that's definitely something that I enjoy. So I put that into my writing.
Okay, that's wonderful. Let me just get this right back here. And so, as a young adult author, like, what kind of things do you have to take into consideration for writing for that kind of that audience?
Well, I'm very careful with language in the book. That's something that I've had to be very aware of is language. Like, one of the things that I did write that I was very careful when I wrote in the book was any sort of sexual encounters, because I know that is one, like, surefire way to turn people off, is to have too much explicit material in your book. But I also remember when I was a young woman reading a book called The Wind Blows Backwards by Mary Downing Hine. And she's not a particularly well-known author, but she was a really good descriptive writer. And I read her book when I was probably 15 years old. And the way she described the relationship between the two main characters and their love of each other and their feelings, and then eventually their sexual relationship, even though it was a young adult novel, it was so tastefully done that I really enjoyed the way that she had approached that, because it was romantic and it was raw, but it was also really tasteful and carefully constructed. And I admired that about her writing. So I took that to heart when I approached those sorts of topics, because sexuality and sexual experiences are a big part of growing up and evolving as a human being and discovering what you like or what you don't like. But it's also, when you're a young adult, it's also important to make sure that you talk about things like consent, which is also not talked about a lot of times in fantasy books or in any kind of, fiction, is consent. So I made sure to talk about that in the book as well, about the importance of consent, getting consent, receiving consent, and having my characters have open conversations about what consent was.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a very important and very healthy topic to have, and unhealthy if it's avoided, for sure. And so when fantasy worlds normally involve a lot of fleshing out of characters, of worlds, all this world building, that can, from experience, that can be very taxing. Mentally, it can be very taxing in many aspects of having to, that feeling of having to get it right, but it's such a big and grand task. What are tips that you have that you can share with people from your experience of handling that in a positive way?
Do your research. Depending on where you're setting it, if you're creating a world from scratch, then it would be extremely important to actually do even drawings, abstract drawings, maps, finding out how things like water works. Like, for example, when I was in my early 20s, I was running a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and I was talking about, and I'd created the scene from scratch. I'd created a world from scratch, and I had made the mistake of discussing how the river ran through the mountains, and people kind of laughed at me. And and I didn't understand why they were laughing at me. And they said, well, rivers don't run through mountains, rivers run from the mountains, because that's how the water comes off of the ice caps, and then it flows and it comes down, and then that's where streams and rivers are made. And I didn't know that. So I lost all credibility in the first 10 minutes of my campaign because I hadn't done the research as to how this actually works, how the even the basic things of the environment of where I was talking about worked. And it was, so then I just, made a joke about how a wizard did it, and then it was fine. But when I was doing the story of Northern Lights, the Druid of Black Lake, well, Black Lake, even though it's not an actual place in Canada, it is based on an actual place in the Northwest Territories called Norman Wells. And I have talked to several people who live in Norman Wells as well as live in the Northwest Territories, and did a lot of research into the place before I wrote the book, because I wanted to make sure that it was accurate, or as accurate as possible, without actually naming the complete real place in the book.
That's awesome. Yeah, I wouldn't have imagined that you have to do research into even like geology and stuff like that. That's really interesting that you bring that up. So I think that's pretty much the end of the questions that I have for you today. I'm going to hand it over to viewers now. If you have any viewer questions, start typing those out. I will read those out to Elizabeth here. But one question I do have while people are typing questions here, I've asked a lot of different creators, from musicians to artists, illustrators, writers, what it's been like creating work during this time with the pandemic. And I've largely heard from people from the cities, from Saskatchewan, from Regina, and from the big centres in the UK. But I want to get that rural aspect. What has it been like for you creating and publishing the work during this time in a place as rural as Wynyard?
Well, see, I actually have found the pandemic to be a really good place to be creative. I'm a bit of a homebody anyway, and I enjoy my own company, which I think is important. And my wife understands that I enjoy my own company, and I like to write, and I like to read a lot. So she's been a really good support of all that. I don't know if I would have written my book without the pandemic, to be honest, because I found that without the expectations of being social and going to and fro places and gathering with people, I don't know if I would have made time for it. But because I was left to my own devices a bit more, I found my way back to it. And now I don't know if I'll ever stop. So that's pretty great.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I found that with doing these interviews and stuff like this, as I have done through the pandemic, and trying to raise the word about other creators, it's not something that I wouldn't have thought of in a sense of it being intentional or malicious, but I wouldn't have thought to have done it in the way that I have without the pandemic. So I can absolutely see where you're coming from. I think it's the pandemic weird way has led to so many wonderful creative projects. Yeah.
I think it's given us a lot more time to think about what's important to us, especially when there's those of us that come from a place of privilege. Because I recognize that I was able to be safe and healthy in my own home during the pandemic, and I was able to remain at my job, and I was able to maintain my income, and I wasn't afraid of being without during the pandemic. So because of all of those things were already in place for me and my level of privilege that came along with that, it allowed me to be more creative at this time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Doesn't look like we have any viewer questions today, but what I will say for anybody watching live right now, you can follow the Facebook page for Elizabeth's Northern Light series. In the description of this live video, there's a click-through text, Facebook text thing that will take you to the page. You can also buy Elizabeth's books through the links in the description of this live video. So there's a link for Amazon Canada to get it Canada-wide, paperback and Kindle, the same for the UK. And there's also a link where you can order the book through McNally Robinson in Saskatchewan. The book is also available locally in Freeburg Pottery. And where else can people find it, Elizabeth?
At the Wynyard Pharmacy as well.
Wonderful. So there you go. And also, if you're looking for a signed copy mailed out to you, you can, of course, get in touch with Elizabeth through her Facebook page. All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I think I see here in the comments that there have been a couple issues with the live feed, but don't worry, it will go up on YouTube after this, and I will share the link with everybody. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining me. Best of luck with book 2 when that comes out. And just quickly before we go, once the pandemic is over, are there any plans for any live readings or anything like that at McNally Robinson?
I would love to. I would love to. I'm just I just actually sent out mail outs a postcard of my book with information about it to every single independent bookstore in Saskatchewan. And by the end of next week, I will have sent them out, the same postcard out to every single independent bookstore in Alberta and Manitoba. So I'm making my way slowly across the country. And then once I have done that, I'm going to start with the US as well. And hopefully I can get my book into a few different places and people will read it and get something out of it and enjoy it, and that's all I hope to do.
Wonderful. Well, and that's a good excuse to follow the Northern Lights series Facebook page so that you can get updates of when live readings or signings or anything like that will occur once the pandemic is over. All right, well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for joining me. I really appreciate it, and thank you everybody for watching.
Thank you, Mark.